Thank you all for coming. This event is part of Womble Dickinson's thought leadership entitled What the Tech? Decoding Friend or Foe in the Digital Age, which takes a closer look at the disruptive technologies impacting almost every sector and the challenges and opportunities they present for today's business leaders. In this age, big data and analytics has been evolving in almost every sector, and Medtech is no exception. But there are many considerations that are specific to Medtech, such as patient privacy and data collection and protection. For this discussion, we're going to walk through various stages of data progression in Medtech, including ideation, collection, interpretation, management, and evolution. Each of our panelists here tonight are well suited to speak to one or more of these stages based on their respective experiences. So I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists. Here in person, we have Joe Passman to my left. He's a principal R&D engineer at NXT Biomedical. He leads diligence at NXT Biomedical for all potential predictive analytics and AI technology investments. He has experience with device and sensor integration, focusing on quality of sensor data stream. And he's worked as a lead early diligence sensor implant integration engineer at Edwards Life Sciences for chronic heart failure. So thanks for joining us. We also have Keith Kalmas here in person. He's the president of Nested Knowledge. Keith is a serial entrepreneur in medical device and research support software. He's focused on clinical data management for clinical, regulatory, and market access functions. He also has experience working with anything from the small startups to the largest strategic device companies. So thanks, Keith. And also remote, we have Karthika Paramal on the right. She is an IP transactions partner here at Womble Dickinson. She develops IP portfolios with patents, data, and trade secrets, and she also advises on transactions for commercialization and monetization of medical devices and medtech. So, Karthika, are you with us?
I'm here.
Great, we can hear you. And last, we have joining us remotely is Bruno Horta, founder and CEO of Joint Analytics. He's a former university professor. He has worked on data science and machine learning as applied to the biotech, medtech, and health tech industries. And he also has experience with medical device data interpretation, time series feature extraction, and predictive analytics. Bruno, are you with us?
Yes.
Great.
Thanks for the introduction.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll get started with kind of the first stage of data progression, which is really just the ideation and conception of data. And I know Keith has some experience here. So Keith, kind of at the beginning, you're at, I've got an idea, now what type stage. What are some of the problems you're looking to solve? And when you are, is data necessarily the goal, or maybe just a byproduct of what you're setting out to do?
That's a great question. So I would say it depends on who you are and where you're coming from, but usually I would say you start with data and then concepts flow from that. I think everyone would agree that unmet clinical needs are what are going to drive medical device development, no matter what. You could be a massive device company looking to break into a new market or get a leg up on your competitors, or you could be an entrepreneur looking to enter a space, and what you need to find is an unmet clinical need. Otherwise, no one cares. No one will buy your product. No strategic will acquire your product. A committee will not let you into the hospital, and physicians won't even talk to you. It doesn't matter how good your engineers are. It doesn't matter how good your lawyers are. You need that unmet clinical need to move forward. So I think you start with data, and from that flow concepts, right? So even after you're done identifying that unmet clinical need, let's say you need to raise money, right? What you're doing, maybe you have a prototype, but primarily you're trading data for money. And that could be from investors like traditional VC or angel or family and friends. It could be an SBIR, but they're gonna wanna see data. So I would say you start with the data and then you move to the product, not the other way around. Otherwise, you're gonna be solving a problem that possibly doesn't exist.
Sure. And so if you're starting with data, are you starting maybe with a predictive or prognostic goal or a diagnostic goal, or how do you go about kind of that type of unmet clinical need?
I It's a great question. I think I would start with two types of data if you're in medical device. I think if you're in, radiology or medical devices, as a software as a medical device, it's probably different. But if you're starting with that unmet clinical need, you want to go probably first to the literature or any proprietary data sets you can get your hands on to say, what is a therapy that outperforms similar therapies that clinicians aren't using? And then once you've identified that, you go to, well, why aren't the physicians using it? So I think the second type of data you go to after the literature is you call your friends and you say, have you seen the literature on X therapy outperforming Y? And if they say yes, you say, okay, why don't you use Y or X over Y? And they'll tell you. And I think that's customer discovery data. That is harder to get to than the literature. So I would start with the literature and make sure you've found an unmet clinical need before you start generating that customer discovery data. And I think then you go to the bench. After you've identified unmet clinical need and you've then gotten the customer discovery data together, that's how you're going to prioritize your specs when you're developing that medical device.
Yeah. And Joe, I know, you take it from there a lot as an engineer, but I know you've also done a lot of work at this stage too. What are kind of your thoughts when you're just starting out?
Yeah, so I came from Edwards Life Sciences, and Edwards was really cool when I left the company. We started a process called, most people here are probably familiar with the Stanford biodesign process, and that was kind of indoctrinated in me when we were at Edwards, and like you were mentioning, the Stanford biodesign process really centers on finding that unmet clinical need. But I think one of the things that when we talk about data that's so challenging is data is like basically any bit of information that's out there, and so you really have to have a core focus. And for me, it's really been on heart failure, and I think there's so many things that are kind of out there that they try to prognosticate heart failure, they try to change like the outcomes of heart failure, but I think that you need to start with that central need, and then you need to focus on making sure any insight that you may have into how you might solve that problem. In this instance, it's heart failure. You work with clinicians and say, hey, have you worked with this biomarker? Have you worked with any of this other type of thing, and how do you use it in your routine clinical practice? And then if you build kind of a synthesis of that composite data, you kind of say like, okay, am I going to do more with that information as a synthesis of my composite data? But yeah, like all the time, we screen needs that are pretty much junk, and it's good. It's good to kind of start and filter things through a process. So that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. And so once you're kind of at that point, maybe you think you found an unmet clinical need, or something that you think might be a worthwhile endeavor. How do you go about deciding if there's a market for it, if it is something that someone's gonna be interested in if you go through with it?
So fortunately for me, I have and I've just met a lot of doctors through a lot of time working at Edwards and NXT, and I think one of the things that I try to do is just have conversations. I typically have about 5 conversations a week with KOLs. And it's a weird, I don't really like the word KOLs. I just kind of call them friends that I kind of talk to. And so we just kind of shoot ideas back and forth. And if something starts to hit between multiple people, usually I'm like, okay, let's dig deeper into it. And fortunately for me, also we have a nice market research arm through the VC that is invested in our startup. And so they're able to kind of work together with me to field surveys across a large range of specialties. And so we'll typically field those surveys, but I don't think you need that large kind of VC arm as well. So for anybody that may not have that, I've used Google Forms to kind of synthesize and send out surveys to a lot of people.
Same. That's the best way. Send an email with a Google form attached. People are actually much more willing to fill that out than you think.
Yeah. But basically, once I start to get a lot of resonance that this is a need worth solving, then I'll start to kind of say, does data actually have play here? What's going on?
People will tell you when you're doing your customer discovery interviews, you just ask them about their unmet needs, and then half of the people, if it's a good idea, will wind up at your solution. Like they'll tell you during the interview. You don't want to tell them your solution ahead of time because you'll bias your data set, right? You'll turn your data into junk data.
Yeah.
But they'll tell you.
Yeah. And I know, Karthika, we'll reach out to you on this because, I know you do a lot of commercialization and go-to-market strategy. How do you advise clients at this stage, at a very early stage, we're looking to maybe just test the market and see if it's worthwhile?
We usually get in as part of looking at their business plan, right? To see what do they want to do. Once they identify a unmet clinical need, you look at what's the kind of innovation that's going to result from it and where does data play into that. So we usually get in early while we advise our clients. We don't wait for that great innovative step and then start developing strategy. We usually work early stage with them
Great.
to see what would be appropriate.
Yeah, and I know also kind of at this stage, and you both touched on it a little bit in your answer, is securing investment. Whether government grants or self-funded or privately funded. How do you go about deciding what's the right source of investment for your particular project?
Smart money is always best. If you can get money from people who would eventually use your product, that's probably the best. So second company, Marblehead Medical, Mayo Clinic spin out started by my father, my brother, and I ran it. A lot of our early investors were clinicians that we had customer discovery interviews with that said, after we biased our data set, we told them about our idea, they said, I want to invest in that. So if you can get smart money, those people will pay you to help you. Next best would be non-dilutive. So if you can get a government grant, big downside of that is timelines. I think, most grants don't get funded on their first round. So you submit it, and then 9 months later you hear, and then you resubmit it. And then if you get the money, that's 9 months later. And then to get the really big pot of money, that's you have to do that for over 6 months and submit 9 months later. So it's like 2 to 3 years before you can get the big pot of money. So usually with how expensive medical device development is, you're going to have to get VCs or angels, unless you have some super rich friends.
Yeah. And I know, Joe, you've done a lot of pitches in that space.
Yeah. I think it's best to get as scrappy as possible before you ask. And I guess what I mean by that is get as much. There's always ways to get further down the road, I think, with minimal spend. I think for me, I've had the fortunate experience of being really close with collaborators who have, I guess, synergistic needs, I guess. So one example is I'm working with a collaborator in England who has a PhD student, and that PhD student needs to do work. And I was like, well, I have this idea, and it's based on this historical literature precedent for this type of diagnostic that really fell off in the 1960s. And so one really rich source is old historical data, particularly in the medical space, right? There was a lot of research that was done in the 60s, 80s, and 90s that kind of fell off for one reason or another. And so, I kind of said, what do you think about this being a project for him? And basically, he raised grant money to kind of form his work on the side, right? And then he did his PhD research, and we got kind of a handshake agreement to kind of say, okay, we can use that data to pitch to VCs. So we got further down the road that way, right? And saying like, now we have kind of some actual concrete data. This is why we're confident in it, and this is why we think we can build a good diagnostic around it. But then the pitch becomes much easier because then they don't have to worry about spending their money as much.
If you have co-founders too, you're basically printing work instead of having to get money, right? Giving out equity to co-founders is printing work.
Yeah.
So that helps. If you don't want to be scrappy, you don't want to raise money, print some equity, compensate people with it.
Absolutely. Karthika, do you have any kind of final thoughts on this before we move on to the next stage?
No, I agree that do not spend too much early stage while you're digging through this. I completely agree with what Joe said. Be scrappy, try to get as much of resources going till you better define the problem and the solution.
Great. So we'll move on to the next stage then, which is after you've got this idea, maybe you've tested the market, maybe you've secured some investment, or at least know where that might come from. You want to move on to the data collection, which kind of the boots on the ground engineers are moving towards how to collect the data, what signals you're looking for, how to acquire those signals. So I'll start with Joe as our engineer here. How do you decide what type of data you're trying to collect and how you want to go about collecting it?
I think that's a good question. I think that in the medical space, there's basically two forms of data. There's novel diagnostics, there's novel biomarkers, and then there's something that kind of has been around for centuries, or probably not centuries, but at least for a few 50 years or so. But I think when you kind of think about those, there's things like heart rate, there's blood oxygenation, things like that, where you can kind of, say, these signals have been validated. They know how to collect the data. There are consistent streams of data and information. And then there's these novel ones that you kind of have to say, do I know what I'm measuring? Do I know that that's accurate relative to kind of a gold standard? So I think those two fall into two different camps. I think when you look at a problem kind of that's worth solving, you kind of try to talk to your clinicians and say, do you think that this type of information would help me solve this problem? I think a lot of people think of predictive analytics as a black box, which it's really not. I think that you really need to think about, is this data even related to the pathophysiology that I'm trying to correct? And if it is, then great. But I think that you can't just throw data at a problem. It actually has to have some physiologic link. And if the data through predictive analytics is potentially synergistic, then you maybe have a winner. And I think that's kind of how I think about the data, but I really think about good data first.
Yeah. And, I know in the medtech industry specific, everyone's out collecting data, but, there is a physiological context to a lot of this data. And I know, in a traditional sense, maybe it's just kind of an analog signal acquisition that from maybe a well-known EMG type signal or EEG or something. But I know you also work on, novel signals and composite signals and everything. Could you talk a little bit about, how you would go about with a new physiological signal?
Yeah, so one of the devices that I'm working on is a diagnostic for heart failure, like I mentioned, with the primary goal of reducing heart failure hospitalizations. Heart failure hospitalizations is a massive problem in the U.S. It's a $10 billion problem, and the problem is like, it's kind of like it's something where you basically, as a patient, you wake up in the middle of the night and you feel like you can't breathe. You literally feel like you're drowning, and so you go to the hospital. And so, as a physician, you really want to prevent your patients from feeling like that. And then as a payer, you really want to say, yeah, I want to keep my patients out of the hospital because it's expensive, and I can't keep them there that long. And so, I think for me, when I think about that as my motivation to solve a problem. I think about signals that maybe are related to that, and then I land on kind of a novel signal that through, searching in the literature may have a promise. And so I really try to dig deep into the physiology textbooks of saying like, this was studied, it has a physiologic link. And then I just talk and say, like, is it actually going to have some promise in the future? And then once we do that, we do small scale experiments and then carry it forward that way. Yeah.
And I know, Bruno, I know that you've kind of faced this problem or issue on the other side where as a data scientist, someone like Joe will hand you data. How do you handle data that has come from a well-known source versus data that's kind of come from a novel source, a novel signal or sensor or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are many devices out there that are based on signals that are quite well known. You can think of a mobile phone, for instance. You have several sensors in a mobile phone, and there are many people trying to develop apps to connect to physiological data, but using predictive analytics from the mobile phone signals, for example. Right. So this is one type of data. But most of these data are collected from sensors that are well established, like accelerometers, or even the microphones of the mobile phones have been used to monitor sleep quality, for example. And people try to connect that to the physiology. In the case of novel signals, it's a bit more complicated because one has to validate not only the connection between the signal and the physiology, but also the precision and accuracy of the sensors that are being used to collect those signals. So reproducibility, for example, is a major issue. So you can develop prototypes, but one has also to be careful that these sensors they are not you know, let's say in a first attempt they may not be perfectly engineered, and they can give you a wrong view of what has been collected in the first experiments. But with progress of the experiments and with building new sensors and comparing them to see if they are reproducible, then this data can reveal the potential of this device in connecting to this to the signal that you want to measure. So there are this type of analytics for validating the methodology of data acquisition in terms of the sensors that you're using to measure the data. So this is something to take into account in the scenario that Joe described, where you have a completely new signal that is not well understood, and when you have a completely new sensor that you are developing.
Yeah.
So in the case of the diagnostic that I'm working on, basically, like Bruno was mentioning, we have a real significant risk of a phenomenon called drift. And so basically the diagnostic that I'm working on should trend upward when it basically is predicting an incidence of heart failure. And then when the heart failure risk is reduced, it should trend downward. But the challenge, or one of the challenges, is that that sensor could drift upward only because of kind of inherent things like tissue overgrowth or any physiologic interaction that really isn't associated with that heart failure. And so one of the things that actually Bruno and I have worked on together is showing that there's, through kind of these early analytics that are not necessarily predictive, that we're just showing that the drift is not happening. And so we can demonstrate that we're actually tracking the physiology like we want to. So we spend a lot of time before we can build these large scale big data algorithms, making sure that the sensor is doing what we think it's going to do.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into, a lot of companies will just collect data indiscriminately just because they want to make sure they have all the data that they can get. How do you go about, I know we were talking about good data versus bad data, and I think you said garbage in equals garbage out. How do you go about, collecting good data and rejecting bad data and making sure that what you have is in good shape for when you pass it off to someone like Bruno?
Yeah, in the case of sensors, I really think about kind of, and these are probably big words, but I think about the core kind of, engineering principles when I think about kind of like, is a sensor good? So I think about things like drift. I think about things like linearity, hysteresis, which is basically like how accurate it is on the upswing and how accurate it is on the downswing. So really kind of focusing on basically making sure that the sensor is performing to spec kind of in a well-known controlled setting. So in the case of a pressure sensor, for example, you really want to basically test that in a water bath. A water bath doesn't have things like blood cells and things that clot on it, right? So does it work in a water bath? Okay, good, check. Okay, then when I take it to my pig or my small animal, does it continue to work relative to reference or kind of existing gold standards? So in the case of a pressure sensor, you guys may have heard of a device called the CardioMEMS device, but you compare that to something like a Molar or a well-known pressure sensor or a Edwards differential pressure transducer. And so you kind of really focus on making sure it's a good relative to kind of whatever gold standard may exist. Yeah. And if it doesn't, then you work on it with your clinicians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Bruno, how do you handle if someone gives you maybe a large set of data, and I guess, what would be something you would look for that would be helpful for you in terms of that data set being, full of good data, and what are things that are not so helpful, and you've maybe got some bad data in there as well?
Yeah, I like to approach this in the following sense. We serve our clients in terms of helping them interpreting the data. So I like to have the opportunity to talk to the engineers that are acquiring this data and to investigate with them at early stage what's the source of the data, because sometimes we can even give hints in terms of what could improve the data collection so as to avoid the problem of having useless data at some stage. So if this dialogue, if this conversation happens, then we move much faster in terms of designing experimental setups that will collect the data in a proper way. So this communication is really important between the teams. So the team that is collecting the data, communicating with the team that analyzes the data. So I think that that is the crucial step. Also, we have to understand that the moment of the project can vary a lot, right? So as Keith said at the beginning, you can go from the ideation of the project, trying to make the first evidences that something can work, and then you move to proof of physiology. We have when you have more controller assays and more replicas of the experiment, and then before you move to a prototype where you already have some degree of automation and some predictive analytics, and at last you will have your final product where everything has to be not only automated but also compliant to the regulations and with the data security protocols implemented. So depending on each stage of the development of the device, the quality of data will vary dramatically. So in the beginning, we are talking about experiments, like really scientific experiments. And at the end of the pipeline, we are talking about more about the development of a final product. So there is a wide range of variability in terms of the quality of the data itself.
Yeah.
So Tyler, actually, here I wanted to add in from the legal side, right, to get clean data, make sure that the rights that you're acquiring to get the data, you have all the rights, especially if you are not developing your own sensor, you're using a wearable that is already in the market. So make sure your device and the data that's collecting, you have access through it, and also the subjects and patients from which you're collecting data. Because depending on the jurisdiction, you may not be able to go beyond the scope of what you had disclosed to the subject or patient, and that would affect your future sale of those data sets.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I'll kind of open this up to anyone who wants to speak on it. But on that point, I know there are different types of data sets. You can have there are commercially available data sets. There are private data sets, and then to some extent you can make novel data sets, of course, if that's what your project entails. How do you go about choosing what type of data set to select?
I think that depends on what exact point you're at in the device development process, right? So, like I mentioned, literature, step one. Step two is probably market and or user data. But obviously, when you get into like DV&V, you're actually on the ground doing the actual work of developing that medical device and seeking regulatory clearance. You're going to need a combination of the data, right? They're going to want to see the regulatory data, or the regulatory bodies are going to want to see, clinical data. They're also going to see like things as simple as like burst on a catheter, right? Will it harm the patient? What are the particulates? So in terms of being able to predict whether or not you'll pass or fail those tests that you're going to do at a third party for, regulatory reasons, that will save you a lot of time and money if you know whether or not you'll pass those. I think then when you get out onto the marketplace, having a combination of financial data to know where your competitors are at, clinical data to know how you're going to sell, and then like economic data, right? Health economic data, that will then convince payers to buy your product or to reimburse for your product, rather.
Yeah. Cool. So, the next stage in the data progression, at this point, once you've got a data set, one way or another, whether an engineer has has developed a novel set, or you have a set that's commercially available, or however, then they have to pass this on generally to someone who can interpret the data. And so in this sense, let's take our R&D engineer, Joe, who has a data set, who passes it on to Bruno. How does that interaction start? How do you two kind of, because there's probably a bit of a back and forth there.
Oh, I could start about how I started working with Bruno. So I came from a background of modeling protein folding randomly with Bruno's coworker, I guess, or his co-founder, and I had this very large time series data set from a series of physiology experiments where we induced heart failure in a pig, and then we took away that heart failure, and then I kind of had this composite set of signals, and I said, Bruno, like, look, I think something's happening here, but I need you to build kind of a model of what's happening, of kind of like, let's look at kind of the relative scale of my novel signal relative to all of the other physiology, and can we work together to figure out what's happening? And kind of where I was at was, it was kind of a bandwidth and probably a mental limitation of where I was like, this is too much data that my Python skills can't chunk it down appropriately. And so I just called Bruno up and I said, hey man, like, I've got this 500 gigabyte data set. Can we make sense of it together? And that's how we started. But yeah, he's really experienced in time series analysis and feature extraction, and particularly for this sensor. Like I said, the sensor, like, the signal goes up when you're about to get heart failure, and then it goes down. But there's all this kind of interesting things that happen in between that, where the patient's lying down and gets up. And in heart failure, a lot of the hemodynamics will change when the patient, like, if you, I don't know if you've ever kind of, you probably haven't because you all look pretty healthy. But when patients that are sick with heart failure, if they lay down, their cardiac pressures actually increase. And then if you flip them on their head, which most people wouldn't do, but I don't know if you've ever been on an inversion table, but you can actually, all of that fluid in your legs will push down on your heart. So we did that to the pig, and we have all these things that are doing that. We flip the pig upside down, whatever. And I said, Bruno, can we make sense of that? And one of the things that he found was that when we do that, as the pig gets more fluid on board and they get more sick with heart failure, kind of crazier things start to happen. And so we were able to kind of pick out new features of that signal just by looking at that data. So I think what's cool is you have all this engineering knowledge, but then you have these guys that, like, study basically lines on a computer all day. And they say, can we make sense out of those lines? And can we figure out anything cool about it? And I think that's where really cool algorithms can come out, where you can really make these novel predictive insights that me just twiddling with sensors, may not have.
Yeah, and I'll just tell my own anecdote on that kind of thing to lead into a question to Bruno. But and I know just from school, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not an engineer, but I was in school and labs and everything. I remember everyone was pretty good at handling all the physical stuff. You could build the breadboards, and you could dissect all the frogs and everything. But it's when you got the data and then the teacher said, okay, now you need to do something with this, and set up your MATLAB or whatever. That got to the point where everyone had kind of hit a wall. Well, at least I know I did. And it seemed that you'd always want the TA over at your desk, because the TAs would, if they were nice, they would help you out. But it always just kind of seemed like pulling back a curtain. It was like, man, that is just magic, which it's almost like seeing the Matrix. It's like something that only data scientists can see, and to everyone else, it's just numbers. So with that, Bruno, how do you do it? How do you go for people who don't do this every day? In I guess the simplest terms possible. How do you go about building a model, maybe a predictive model or a neural network or something?
Yes. So I go back to my point. The most important thing is to have an open communication channel with the scientists that is behind the idea. So working with Joe has been very fruitful because of this. And one of the things that sometimes happens, that we get the data, right? And in principle, we try to make sense of this data, and we have to go back to the engineer, ask a few questions, and then we go back to the data. So this interaction is very important for getting a complete knowledge of what's going on. And then we start writing more sophisticated algorithms when we understand and making clearer plots and analysis, and coming back with a report that outlines all the different results that were obtained from the analysis. And then it's also very interesting to talk again and to see what the expert in the field will understand from the analysis that I give back. And then very fruitful discussions come from this point. And then the knowledge is constructed from there.
Yeah. Any final thoughts from Keith or Karthika? I know it's, neither of you are data scientists, but at this point, maybe towards the end of where someone gets you to that point, what are you looking for?
All I would say is pre-specify your data elements. If you essentially build out what you're collecting ahead of time, you'll save Bruno a massive amount of headache of data cleaning. I've seen this 1,000 times, right? Well planned. Take the time at the beginning to define your data elements, to write a protocol, really, for how that data is going to be collected. And then on the back end, it'll make his life a lot easier versus, a scattered, disgustingly dirty data set that, I'm sure we've all seen in clinical medicine too many times.
Yeah.
Well, and that's also the value, right? Sometimes clients come to us and say, why is my technology and innovation not valued as much? And I think people underestimate the value of clean data sets. It's especially when we see it towards the very end, when it's being acquired by a third party, the value of having a clean, reliable data set, both training, testing at all stages, makes a difference, big difference in valuation.
Yes.
Yeah. So and that kind of leads us into the next stage. So you've collected, you've had your idea, you've collected data around it, and now you've interpreted it. So you hopefully have something at this point, something you can work with. So moving on to data management, and I'll start with Karthika on this. You have something now. What? So I guess first, how do you protect it? I know there are a lot of IP, patent, trade secret, copyright that kind of surround this. How do you go about advising your clients on that?
I usually ask clients to take a very holistic view of what do they want to protect, right? What aspects have the most value, and also the timeline of protection, right? And what countries are their customers in, where is that value, and how do they want to get to market? Because whether you're protecting it using a patent strategy, a trade secrets, copyrights, or even contracts, they're not independent circles, right? They're all overlapping circles. And this goes back to what I started with, saying developing a holistic strategy, working at every stage, make sure your IP strategy fits where you're going. Especially if you're talking to lots of people, then a trade secret may not be your best strategy. You would need to look at a more patent-focused strategy. But patents come with their own challenges, especially in the US, where patent eligibility plagues software-based patents. So you kind of have to balance how much can you disclose, what kind of protections you need to place for your systems and mathematical models. And does everyone need to know your models, right? Not all your collaborators need to know the entirety of it. So manage your disclosures, manage and discuss which of the IP strategies best fit you so that you can move fast and communicate, right? Patent attorneys or IP attorneys are only as good as what our clients tell us. And most data clients are like, I don't think anything's patentable. I'm just applying this. And I'm like, no, you got to step back and look at it from all sides. And we can draft patent applications or craft a trade secret strategy. To most of my clients right now, it is a combination of copyrights to the code and their database, patents to some of their algorithms and how it's being applied to solve a clinical need, and then trade secrets for how it actually works.
Yeah. And so let me just kind of give you a, I guess, hypothetical that comes up a lot. For me, at least, someone will come to you at this stage, which to an engineer seems very developed, but of course, on the business side and the legal side, it's very early on. And they say, I'm early. I haven't filed anything. I need money. So I need to go, pitch these to investors. I also need some credibility potentially. So I need to go get these peer reviewed and potentially published in journals. What's the best strategy at that point, for how they can do that in the most responsible way so that they're not forfeiting their rights, but they're still able to get what they need to continue moving the project forward?
The US is, like most jurisdictions, is now a first to file. So I strongly recommend put your stake in the ground, file that provisional application, and get your 1-year window while you're looking to see what else, right? Sometimes people come to us too late. They have not used appropriate disclosures, protections, and non-disclosure agreements. And the other place where I see some tension is if you're going and pitching to VCs or even early stage incubators, is they're like, we won't sign a non-disclosure agreement. Don't come to us with that, right? So in those situations, I'm usually, let's file that initial provisional applications, put the stake in the ground, craft some non-confidential descriptions of your innovation so you can go pitch to people, sign non-disclosure agreements, give them a little more scope, and do a measured, deliberate management of your disclosure with even your collaborators.
Yeah. And yeah, I'll just echo that, in my own experience. I think NDAs and provisional applications are, as you said over and over, are really the best ways to get started because, people do come too late sometimes. They think they need a full prototype before they file a patent application, but you don't. Their provisional patent applications can be filed, very quickly, and relatively inexpensively. So that's always the first thing I recommend because that gets your filing date in place. And even if someone won't sign an NDA, they still are going to have to deal with that if they try to take your concept. So I agree with that. So if we're looking then at let's say you're looking at potentially a trade secret or something that you're not sure you want to file for yet, you're not sure you want it to be out there, but you're still concerned internally. What are some corporate measures that you could take with your employees and even with any outside help that you've hired?
Again, I cannot stress enough about non-disclosure agreements, even between co-founders. It is inevitably an issue where 3 or 4 people get together, they're all good friends, they are talking about different aspects of the innovation, and things don't go, right? 8 months later, one of them is like, hey, it's my idea, and then walks away. Right, then the company kind of loses value, the corporate entity loses value. So I'm a big believer of no matter how good my friends are, there should be a contract in place to protect the company.
Spoken like a lawyer.
I know, sounds like a lawyer, and but we sign waivers when I take my 5-year-old to bouncy house, right? So why is that contract that had and also, the largest amount of trade secret litigation comes from employees who leave and walk away, right? So trade secrets is so valuable, especially in the US right now, over the last 5 years, where we have both federal level trade secret protection has come in. I am like, do not work with anyone as an employee, as a collaborator, unless they sign that non-disclosure agreement in early stages, right? Make sure that intellectual property gets assigned to your company. The company has value from day one. A lot of people discount the know-how that different people are bringing to the table. And putting it all in writing, collecting these buckets really adds value to, it's always a patent plus portfolio that somebody's buying nowadays. Very rarely people are buying just patents in the medtech space.
Yeah. So let me move on a little bit outside of the legal, because I'm sure people have heard enough of two lawyers going back and forth. Let me kick it to Keith on the business side. So let's say that you're at this stage and you even have potentially some protection or some early filings in place. How do you decide what to do with that? Do you collaborate and license with other companies? Do you keep it to yourself and you try to kind of corner the market? How do you go about marketing at this point?
So I would say there are kind of two options. You could go the trade secret route, or you could also always go like radically open, right? I'm actually a big fan of open source or open access in publishing for data. You're just kind of like throwing in your lot and we're saying we're all in together, we're all going to pull our data and we're all going to have access to each other's data. So I think you either have to pick 0 or 1, either keep it totally under the hood or be totally open with it. And if you do the open source, you basically create a tree where anyone basing their solutions on you cannot not make that open source. So I think there are 1 or 2 options. I love the openness, right? My co-founder Carl built a now very downloaded meta-analytical software named Shukra after the Hindu goddess with a bunch of many arms. And that's been downloaded thousands of times now, and it independently gives you credibility in your business, right? Why are you hosting this event? Gives you credibility in your business, helps you sell. So I think you can gain value from data you're putting out there in an open fashion, even if you're not selling it. But yeah, if you want to benefit for a sell it, do not distribute it, keep it under the hood, don't talk about it.
Yeah. And Joe, I'll go to you. Kind of part of maybe the collection stage, but also a consideration here, privacy issues with data, especially in healthcare with so much patient privacy issues. How do you go about kind of handling that and navigating those types of issues at this stage?
Yeah, I think, I think for me, it's when we're engaging with a clinical site, particularly for a human study, a lot of the work that I do is preclinical, but when we are doing human studies, we'll typically work through established electronic data capture platforms. So things like Castor, EDC, things that have been HIPAA compliant and validated, and things that I don't have to think about, but they rubber stamp it. I'll do that. I've worked on remote monitoring trials as well as part of a device study, a therapeutic device for heart failure, not a diagnostic, but we've worked with a platform called Doctella, which is actually, I think, part of Massimo now. But basically, I try to stick to established systems where I can and get creative, and I don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's kind of what I do when I work looking towards patient privacy. And just knowing what HIPAA is and making sure that I don't share an investor deck, a screenshot of a fluoro or an X-ray image with a patient name in it. Just simple stuff like that. Yeah.
Pretty simple.
Yeah.
Cool. So
Blind yourself. Blind yourself. That's the solution to that. Blind yourself.
Yeah. So at this point, you've kind of gotten through this part, and maybe you're into market. What is next? I'll kind of open this up for everyone. What is next in terms of evolution? And this goes from what do you think is next in data, and then also from where do you go? How do you take what you've learned in this project and start all over again in the ideation phase? Let me start with Bruno, our data guy. What do you think is next for data and maybe in medtech and healthcare with consumerization of data with apps, health apps, but also patient data in hospital settings?
Yeah, that's a tough question. There are many ways to approach, but I would say that just in terms of, I wanted to make a parenthesis about the security of the data. When you hold databases of patients, then you have to be extra careful with that. Then you have to put many technological systems in place also to protect from virtual cyber net attacks. So from ransomware. So be aware of that if you hold any kind of database on patients, because this is a liability sometimes. And about strategy for the ideation, that depends a lot, because we are a service company mainly. So we help our clients with their with solidifying their ideas and proving their points and their values, but maybe from someone that is starting all over again in terms of a new idea, then I think the process will restart also from the beginning of the conversation. As Keith mentioned, data is there even before you start your project. So going back to the literature and making all the assessment in terms of what is valuable and what kind of route you have to take, I think that would be my approach, but I'll leave to the experts.
Yeah, Keith, how do you approach moving on to the next project and moving forward? Expanded
indication would be my number one. And I think pharma's been doing this for years, right? Viagra started for like heart, that's a vasodilator, found a better use for it to make money. I think devices are going to do the same. I actually have a great example from work we just did with Dr. Jeremy Hyde at Stanford. He published on common data element use in chronic subdural hematoma treatment with liquid embolics, which, a lot of people in the neurovascular space would recognize those. Tons of uses all over the body, periphery, neuro. Physicians started using it to treat chronic subdural hematoma. Strategics noticed, hey, we can expand our indication to include treatment for chronic subdural hematoma. You basically skip having to develop a new device, and you get to get an expanded indication, get a whole new market based off of that, and all you needed was the data. And simply by then identifying that unmet clinical need, with seeing how physicians are deploying it, you just designed your trial, right? You just did all your work for the whole device development process in one data set analysis. And then you're basically there. And of course, you have to spend millions of dollars and run a clinical study, but that's cheaper than developing a whole new medical device.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I want to leave some time for some audience questions, but does anyone have any final thoughts that they want to share on anything that we talked about here on the panel? All right, we can just open it up. Does anyone have any questions for the panel? Let me bring over the mic here.
Thanks. I'm Dave Ferrer. A couple young guys up here on the podium, very young careers. What's next? Broad question.
What's next with the career or with the device development or?
Okay, I should probably dial that in.
Pare it down a little bit.
All right, so you're in cardiovascular.
Yeah.
You're in data collection. Okay. What's next in cardiovascular? Give us the future. I know without any disclosure.
What's not next is like, well, I don't.
No, what's not next? I don't want to hear that. Okay. So without disclosing whoever you're working for, where do you see the horizon in your young career? What's next in cardiovascular?
Yeah, I think it's on the structural front. It's continuing to make things less invasive. I think it's there's still room for therapies to kind of reduce the invasiveness of existing treatments. So I guess in structural health space, that's still something I think there's opportunities to do. I think there's creative structural heart solutions that still exist. And then I think there's also room for novel diagnostics and I think in terms of data, what's next, I think there's room for novel diagnostics that maybe are collected on a point-by-point basis in the clinic, but are transitioned towards something that can be collected more longitudinally, sort of in the home setting or kind of long-term, and then also for novel biomarkers. So I think one of the conversations that I had with a heart failure physician is he said, well, I'd love to collect BNP is a well-known heart failure diagnostic. So he said, I'd love to collect that longitudinally, and I wouldn't want it just as kind of a point of care analyzer. So if you could tell me how to collect BNP, I'll just throw a bone if anyone could do it. But I believe in sharing ideas, not solutions. But he said, if you could give me a way of collecting BNP longitudinally without having to do a finger prick, similar to how a continuous glucose monitor is doing it, he says he could really revolutionize the care of his patients.
So you're part of a group called NXT?
Yeah.
And that's next, right?
Stan doesn't like to call it next, but yeah, it's called next. Yeah.
I just think that's pretty revolutionary. All right, well, that's pretty great. So, and you came out of Edwards Life Sciences? Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. All right. Kevin, what's next? In data management or data collection or literature?
This is based on the last conversation we had. It's expanding the databases you plug into while increasingly winnowing on relevant data, right? I think I had a conversation with Scott about this. Like, big data exists, but it's really your problem. Your solution is narrowing down to the relevant data. So not just literature, like clinicaltrials.gov, right? MAUDE. All of these databases are out there with all of these clinical events. If you can then, I talked to Bruno about this too, right? I think everyone recognizes plugging into those data sources and being able to successfully winnow down to the tiny relevant patient population that you're actually interested in. Marblehead, the device company, like 2,000 patient data points, 2,000 that we used for every stage of the device development process, same 2,000 patient data points. But that's out of millions of published papers, and then that's a small portion of it, right? All these proprietary data sets, all these publicly available data sets. The US federal government alone has several relevant ones you could be plugging into. It's successfully combining them, right? So that's a problem for data scientists to do. It's not easy though, otherwise someone would have done it.
Okay, I could listen to these guys talk all night because I think these are the future. An engineer, a data scientist. I could listen to these guys talk all night, and I'll pass the microphone along.
Is there anyone else who wants to ask?
Wait, he didn't ask the lawyers what's next?
The lawyers? I employ 7 lawyers right now. You want them? I'll employ you.
No.
Yes.
I don't need 8. Maybe I do need 8.
Good.
Hi, my name's Alan. The process seems a little bit too clean to me in a way. It's, for instance, how do you differentiate between a bad data set and a set of data you just don't understand yet? It's like, it isn't that you gave them bad data, we just don't understand the data. So there's more to be discovered there.
Joe?
Yeah, I think either me or Bruno could answer that. I think in some cases it's clear if it's bad data, and I think in other cases it could be an observation, right? That it can lead to something more insightful. I think it depends on the context, and I think you really have to go back towards how you collected that data and really focus on, was everything set up right? Was my line correct? So in the case of, I guess, hemodynamics, right? Was I in the right chamber of the heart? I had an example of this where we were supposed to be collecting left ventricular pressure, and we were correlating that with another signal. And there was good correlation, and all of a sudden there wasn't. And so in some senses you could say, okay, that because that correlation fell off, it's our sensor's bad, right? And so it was like, okay, let's dig into this a little bit deeper, and we collected the data over, I think it was was, I think it was 12 hours. And so it was compressed waveform data. And so we said, let's look into that data a little bit more. And then when we looked at it very much more closely, we noticed that it was actually, instead of a left ventricular waveform, it was actually an aortic pressure waveform. So the catheter had backed out into the aorta, and we were actually not collecting left ventricular pressure anymore. And so in that case, it's like pretty simple, right? You kind of just say, oh, I know my physiology. This is bad data, right? Because it backed out. So it's probably a case-by-case thing, but in that example, we kind of just dug deeper, and instead of looking at it at a macroscopic level, we said, let's look at the waveform level data, see what that tells us. And in that case, it told us it was bad data. But
Yeah.
So let me quickly add a point on that. Sorry. For example, there are many sources of errors. There is signal to noise ratio. There is for example, the procedure of collecting data, as you mentioned. You can, for example, position your sensors in tissues that are not giving the signal that you want. You mistakenly place this in a region of the body that is not exactly the appropriate place to collect the signals. And there are also environmental sources of noise that you can also mitigate by doing more controlled experiments. So there are many things that can interfere with the quality of the signal that is being measured. And that's why it's very important to make multiple experiments and to compare the reproducibility of those experiments when trying to infer about data quality.
Great. I think do we have one more question in the back?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Stephen. First, I want to thank Joe for introducing the image of an upside down pig earlier in the evening. I thought that was made my evening. Thanks.
for the privacy of the pig, I can't show the picture, but I have it on my phone. Yeah, that's good.
Is the P in HIPAA porcine? The nature of my question is around value proposition. So, all data, all decisions, healthcare decisions are contextual, right? So one signal may be helpful. But my question is, do you see in the future the real value coming from integrating signals and data? And you were sort of heading that way relative to, so my background is some in the hemodynamics, right? So sometimes, depending on where you are on the Frank-Starling curve, this complex cardiorespiratory system, which of any physiologic system, very, very complex, are there areas of low-hanging fruit that a signal data point you see now will be helpful in a remote situation, or is the real value going to be, and I guess the question is, how high is the bar for real value? Is the real value in integrating different measures that haven't been done, to your point, a novel biomarker? I mean, that would be an obvious yes, of course, the real value is there, but you see some low-hanging fruit in the near future that you could get to and add value, keeping in mind it's all contextual?
I think there's real value in existing data that's already kind of there. And I think my former employer is one that's really leveraged that. So Edwards Life Sciences and you're probably familiar with this, but they've developed an algorithm called the hypotension probability indicator. And so, right, they really sourced data and said, let's look at our training data sets with kind of tagged outcomes, and then build in kind of a prediction of a certain hemodynamic collapse. And so I think that there's still probably things out there. So I think one of the things, maybe for example, there's still a really high incidence of post-operative AFib and cardiac surgery. And so maybe there's ways that you can look at the existing hemodynamic data set, for example, and that's collected continuously during cardiac surgery, to basically say we have a risk of post-operative AFib and we should maybe increase our dose of amiodarone. So I think that there's still, amiodarone is an anti-arrhythmic drug, but I think that there's still things out there. I think it's just, for me, it's listening to the physicians about, what data sets are available in certain clinical contexts and what problems still exist to find those low-hanging fruit. But I think there's absolutely low-hanging fruit out there. Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone, and certainly thank our panelists for being here tonight. So this will conclude our panel discussion. But please feel free to hang out for a little bit and grab some food and a drink, and Just meet each other. Thank you, guys.